I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truths. This is Dead City, New York, a series about what cities choose to remember and what they work very hard to forget. Tonight's story isn't about a gang the movies made famous. It's about a group of people history reduced to a name and then blamed for their own deaths. In the mid-1800s, New York called it disorder. The papers called it a riot. The city called it inevitable. But what actually happened in 5 Points wasn't chaos. It was pressure, it was permission, and it was deadly. This is the story of the Dead Rabbits. Not as killers, but as targets. The alley is already slick when he falls. 5 Points doesn't sleep, not really. It just holds its breath between shouts, between boots, between the sound of fists finding bone. Gaslight flickers against brick walls swollen with damp. The smell of rot and waste hangs low, heavy enough to choke. He runs anyway, barely 20, Irish, no coat worth the winter. Blood leaks through his fingers as he stumbles, not from one wound, but many. Knuckles split, scalp torn, ribs screaming every time he draws breath. Someone behind him laughs. Someone else shouts his name like it's a joke. He doesn't see the club until it cracks across the back of his head. He hits the ground hard, face first, teeth cutting his lip. The taste of iron floods his mouth. Hands grab him, rough, practiced, confident. This isn't a fight anymore. It's a lesson. A boot comes down on his shoulder, then another. He curls instinctively, but there's nowhere to go. The alley is too narrow. The wall's too close. Someone's baton rises and falls again and again, the sound dull and wet like meat on wood. A voice cuts through the chaos, calm, official, enough. For a second, he thinks it's mercy. It isn't. The men step back, breathing hard. The one with the badge doesn't rush to help. He looks down instead, at the blood spreading across the stones, at the body shaking and trying not to. Drunk, someone mutters. Riot casualty, says another. The baton drops one last time, not in anger, in conclusion. When it's over, they leave him there. No arrest, no report, no name written down. By morning, his body will be found by someone who knows better than to ask questions. The paper will say found dead under suspicious circumstances. It won't say who swung first. And it will not say what everyone already knows. In 5 Points, some people could be killed and some people could be killed with permission. This wasn't an isolated murder. It was policy. Men like him, young, Irish, poor, turned up dead in 5 Points with grim regularity. Broken skulls, crushed ribs, knife wounds that never made it to trial. Their names blurred together in police ledgers if they appeared at all. And when the papers needed a label, something easy, something disposable, they reached for one. The Dead Rabbits. Not because this man was a killer, but because he belonged to a group the city had already decided was expendable. The Dead Rabbits weren't hunted because they were violent. They were violent because they were hunted. And in a neighborhood where law and politics moved together, their deaths weren't accidents or excesses. They were understood. What happened in that alley didn't just happen to him, it happened to them. To understand the Dead Rabbits, you have to strip away everything history added later. They were a loose, unstable network of young Irish immigrant men living in 5 Points, one of the most overcrowded and violently neglected neighborhoods in 19th century America. Most were barely adults. Many were teenagers. They worked when work existed, dock labor, hauling, street trades, and starved when it didn't. Legal protection was non-existent. Dead Rabbits was not a name they proudly wore. It was a label applied to them by newspapers, by political operatives, by police. Because it was easier to dehumanize a symbol than confront a system, what held them together was proximity, kinship, and shared threat. The Dead Rabbits existed because 5 Points produced men who needed numbers to survive street violence, political intimidation, and open hostility from the city around them. Now let's try to wrap our heads around the infamous Dead Rabbit Riot. Day 1 begins, like so many other nights in 5 Points, with a street fight most people expect to burn itself out. A clash between Irish youths and nativist rivals draws a crowd. Shouting turns to pushing. Pushing turns to weapons. But instead of dispersing, men return, again and again. By nightfall, the streets are no longer contested. They're claimed. Barricades rise from carts and debris. Gas lights flicker as groups surge forward and retreat, like tides testing a shoreline. The first deaths come quickly. A man is beaten and left motionless near an alley entrance. Another is struck during a rush and never gets back up. Gunshots echo, rare enough to freeze the crowd, common enough to resume seconds later. Police attempts to intervene only widen the violence, drawing fire and clubs from all sides. By dawn, bodies lie where they fell, some carried away quietly by friends, others left behind to be discovered. Newspapers will later disagree on the count, but at least several men are dead by morning, and no one is in control. The second day is worse because everyone knows what's coming. Word spreads across the city. Reinforcements arrive, not just gangs, but sympathizers, fire company men, and onlookers pulled into the gravity of it. The fighting moves block to block. Buildings are stormed. Windows shatter. Civilians trying to flee are caught between advancing groups. Violence becomes directional, aimed, deliberate. This is no longer chaos. It's street warfare. More men die. Some are killed outright in clashes. Others collapse later from injuries sustained hours earlier. At least one body is reportedly dragged from the street to prevent identification. The dead are Irish, nativist, and unaffiliated, but the Irish deaths will dominate the aftermath. Police retreat entirely in places. By the time the militia is called in, the streets resemble occupied territory. Armed troops move through 5 points, forcing dispersal at gunpoint. When the fighting finally breaks, it isn't because the violence burned out. It's because the state decided it had gone on long enough. Official tallies list fewer than a dozen deaths. Hospital records suggest more. Witnesses insist the number is higher still. What's clear is this: many of the dead are never named. Causes of death are softened. Riot casualty, unknown circumstances, found dead. No serious inquiry follows. No one is held accountable in proportion to the scale of the violence. And that's how the riot ends, not with resolution, but with silence. In 5 points, violence functioned as communication. It said, don't take this block. It said, don't come down this alley. It said, we are here and we won't disappear quietly. When Dead Rabbits fought, it was usually reactive against rival street groups, against nativist gangs like the Bowery Boys, against police raids that escalated without warning. And that pressure was constant. Irish immigrants in New York were openly portrayed as subhuman, drunks, criminals, animals. Newspapers described their deaths with casual disdain. Courts dismissed cases involving Irish victims with alarming speed. When dead rabbits were injured or killed, it was rarely framed as a crime. Before they were called the Dead Rabbits, they were refugees. Most of the young Irishmen, later labeled as gang members, arrived in New York between the late 1840s and early 1850s, pushed across the Atlantic by famine, eviction, and collapse. Ireland wasn't exporting criminals, it was exporting the dispossessed. They came because they had no alternative. The Great Famine didn't just starve Ireland, it dismantled it. Crops failed, landlords cleared land, and entire families were erased. Passage to America was often paid for by selling the last thing a family owned or by being sent ahead alone, a son, a brother, sometimes a boy barely old enough to work. The journey itself was lethal. Disease-ridden ships, crowded holds, weeks at sea with minimal food. Many didn't survive the crossing. Those who did arrived sick, malnourished, and already marked as undesirable. New York was not a welcome mat. By the time Irish immigrants stepped onto the docks, the city was already hostile. Anti-Irish sentiment was overt and aggressive. No Irish need apply wasn't a metaphor, it was policy. Irishmen were shut out of skilled labor, trade guilds, and most stable employment. Irish women were pushed into domestic service or prostitution. That housing had a name, 5 Points. 5 Points wasn't chosen because it was lawless. It was chosen because no one else wanted it. Irish neighborhoods were heavily surveilled but lightly protected. Police entered 5 Points to raid, beat, or disperse, not to prevent crime or protect residents. If an Irish immigrant was assaulted, robbed, or killed, the likelihood of investigation was slim. If an Irish immigrant fought back, the response was immediate and forceful. How many were there? By the early 1850s, New York City had absorbed hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants, with a heavy concentration of young men clustered in and around 5 Points. This wasn't a small fringe population. It was a massive demographic shift, one the city neither planned for nor wanted. And from the moment they arrived, they were treated as a problem to be managed. They were caricatured in newspapers as violent, animalistic, and incapable of citizenship. Their poverty was framed as moral failure. Their deaths were framed as inevitability. The message was consistent and unmistakable. You are useful, not valued. You are replaceable. So when groups like the Dead Rabbits formed later, they did not emerge from criminal ambition. They emerged from this, from exclusion, from crowding, from constant threat, from a city that made it clear immediately and relentlessly that Irish lives were cheaper than order and far cheaper than reform. Before anyone ever raised a fist under that name, the violence had already begun. Young Irish men in 5 Points clustered together because isolation was dangerous. Most arrived alone or had lost family during the famine or the crossing. They worked irregular jobs and moved through streets where harassment, assault, and extortion were common. Walking alone marked you as a target. Clustering wasn't about ambition or crime, it was about deterrence. Numbers meant someone could drag you out of a beating. Numbers meant you might make it home. These informal groups formed around blocks, boarding houses, dock work crews, and kinship ties from the same counties back in Ireland. Protection came first. Identity came later. The name Dead Rabbits enters the historical record not as a banner they chose, but as a label imposed on them. It appears in New York newspapers in the mid-1850s, often written with mockery or menace, used to bundle disparate Irish youths into a single threatening caricature. There is no founding meeting, no declaration, no leader christening the group. The term was applied after clashes, after street fights, after election violence, after bodies were already in the street. Once the name existed in print, it hardened. Police reports adopted it. Politicians repeated it. What began as a loose survival network was transformed on paper into a gang with a reputation. And that reputation became justification. From that point on, violence against dead rabbits didn't require explanation. The name itself was treated as cause enough. Nativist street groups like the Bowery Boys were not fringe criminals. They were culturally protected, native-born, Protestant, and politically connected. They framed their violence as civic duty rather than crime. When Bowery Boys assaulted or killed Irish men in 5 Points, it was routinely described as restoring order, not committing murder. In Irish neighborhoods, law enforcement functioned as an occupying force. Raids, mass arrests, baton charges, and shootings during crowd control were common, while protection for Irish victims was rare. Newspapers completed the circuit. Coverage consistently portrayed Irish men as inherently violent, drunken, and animalistic, while minimizing or excusing violence done to them. Deaths were downgraded, riot casualty, found dead, unknown assailants, language that erased responsibility. Between nativist gangs, police enforcement, and press framing, Irish deaths became normalized. Violence against them didn't need justification. It already had one. Tammany Hall and its operatives relied on young Irish men to do the dirty work of elections, intimidating rivals, controlling polling places, breaking up opposition gatherings. The arrangement was transactional and cynical. Irish men were offered protection, jobs, or favors in exchange for force, then abandoned the moment violence drew scrutiny. When fights turned fatal, the political machine disavowed responsibility and let the blame settle where it always did, on the Irish themselves. The same men treated as useful enforcers on election day were recast as criminal threats the next morning. This dual role, weapon when needed, liability when exposed, made the Dead Rabbits uniquely vulnerable. They were killed by enemies, punished by the state, and sacrificed by the very system that had profited from their presence. Nativists believed political power and citizenship belonged only to native-born Protestant Americans. Immigrants, especially Irish Catholics, were viewed as a threat to jobs, order, and American identity. That belief translated directly into street violence. Groups like the Bowery Boys emerged from this worldview. They were made up largely of native-born tradesmen and volunteer firefighters who saw themselves as defenders of the city, not criminals. Their clashes with Irish men in 5 Points weren't random turf wars. They were enforcement actions, fueled by the conviction that immigrants needed to be pushed back, disciplined, or driven out. It is odd and uncomfortable until you look at how power actually works. What's happening with the Bowery Boys isn't hypocrisy by accident. It's assimilation through exclusion. Many Bowery Boys were immigrants or the sons of immigrants themselves. But crucially, they were earlier arrivals, mostly Protestant, English-speaking, and already absorbed into what passed for American identity in the mid-19th century. By the time mass Irish Catholic immigration surged during the famine years, these groups had something to lose: jobs, status, and fragile acceptance. The fastest way to protect that status was to draw a line and stand on the right side of it. So they didn't identify as immigrants anymore. They identified as natives. Nativism offered them a shortcut to legitimacy. By positioning themselves as defenders of order against a newer, poorer, visibly Catholic population, the Bowery Boys gained social cover. Volunteer fire companies, street patrols, and political connections reinforced that identity. Attacking Irish immigrants became a way to prove they belonged. This is how one marginalized group is often pulled into enforcing a system that once excluded them. Not by ideology alone, but by reward. Acceptance is dangled, protection is promised, and the cost is turning on the people who arrived after you. Tammany Hall, on the other hand, was New York's dominant political machine built on patronage, votes, and loyalty. Irish immigrants were useful to them, not as citizens to protect, but as numbers and muscle. Young Irishmen were mobilized to intimidate opponents, guard polling places, and disrupt rival campaigns. In return, they might receive a job, legal protection, or temporary favor, but that protection was conditional and disposable. When violence became too visible or too bloody, Tammany distanced itself instantly. The same system that benefited from Irish force quietly allowed Irish men to be blamed, arrested, or killed. Between nativist hatred and political exploitation, the Dead Rabbits were trapped, attacked by those who despised them and used by those who never intended to save them. What history remembers as the Dead Rabbits Riot wasn't a single event. It was the moment years of tolerated violence finally spilled into the open and forced the city to acknowledge, briefly, the cost of ignoring it. Some of you may be picturing the movie Gangs of New York, directed by the phenomenal Martin Scorsese. And you might be thinking about Leonardo DiCaprio's character or about Bill the Butcher. But this is where the movie and the history split. Bill the Butcher never actually existed, and neither did DiCaprio's character. They're fictional stand-ins created to give a face and a narrative arc to violence that, in reality, was far more anonymous. DiCaprio's role loosely reflects the experience of poor Irish immigrant boys, of whom there were many, some of whom were later labeled Dead Rabbits, not because they were leaders, but because they were visible and expendable. Bill the Butcher, meanwhile, is loosely based on a real man, William Poole, Poole was a prominent Bowery Boys figure, a well-known nativist brawler and political enforcer, and a public symbol of anti-Irish violence. But here's the critical fact: movies erase. Poole died in 1855, 2 years before the 1857 Dead Rabbits Riot. He was shot in a separate incident and lingered for days before dying. He wasn't part of the riot. He wasn't killed by the dead rabbits, and he certainly wasn't standing at the center of a final showdown. The film compresses decades of class warfare into a single story. History doesn't give us that convenience. The famous imagery, rabbits on sticks, uniforms, insignia, comes largely from later retellings and popular culture. Real dead rabbits were indistinguishable from their neighbors. The myth made them look organized. There are no memorials, no plaques, no names, no public remembrance of the Irish men killed in 5 Points. The city remembers the riot. It does not remember the dead. That silence is part of the story. What didn't change was how societies decide who belongs and who doesn't. What didn't change was the way violence becomes tolerable when it's aimed at a group already defined as dangerous. What didn't change was the habit of calling systemic failure a riot, instead of asking why pressure was allowed to build until blood spilled into the street. The names change. The neighborhoods change. The logic stays intact. If you lay New York's history end to end, this story doesn't jump around. It moves forward in a straight line. In the 1820s through the 1860s, the earliest were free Black New Yorkers. Long before 5 Points became shorthand for disorder, Black communities were subjected to mob violence, arson, and killings. Riots in 1834 and later during the Civil War draft riots of 1863 killed dozens. Police protection was inconsistent at best. Violence was framed as crowd unrest, not racial terror. For Black New Yorkers, there was no promised assimilation, only containment. In the 1840s and 1850s, the focus shifted sharply to Irish immigrants. Famine refugees poured into the city after 1845 and were concentrated into the worst housing, most famously 5 Points. They were depicted as biologically violent, unfit for citizenship, and incapable of self-rule. Police brutality was routine. Killings were minimized. When violence finally exploded in 1857, history remembered the riot, not the decade of sanctioned harm that made it inevitable. By the 1880s through the early 1900s, the label moved again, this time to Italian immigrants. Italians were framed as inherently criminal and prone to secret violence. Neighborhoods were over-policed, raids were common, and deaths during gang disturbances were treated as collateral. Individual crimes justified collective punishment. Only after political power, unions, and economic stability emerged did Italians stop being the threat. Running alongside this from the 1890s through the 1920s, Jewish immigrants, particularly from Eastern Europe, were targeted in a different way. Less street violence, more institutional harm. Dangerous labor conditions, police suppression of organizing, raids framed as public safety. Jews were portrayed as subversive, radical, disloyal. Fewer riots, but the same disposability. From the 1910s through the 1970s, the Great Migration brought Black Americans from the South into northern cities, including New York. Redlining, aggressive policing, and lethal force followed. Uprisings were labeled riots. Violence was framed as crime control. The language modernized. The logic didn't. In the 1940s through the 1960s, Puerto Rican communities became the next focus. Rapid migration, concentrated poverty, heavy surveillance. Police violence and deaths were minimized. Disorder was blamed on culture, not policy. Once again, harm became expected before it was ever questioned. From the 1970s to the present, Latino immigrant communities, Dominican, Mexican, Central American, have lived under overlapping systems of policing and immigration enforcement, raids, detentions. deaths in custody reframed as enforcement outcomes, violence justified as border control or gang suppression. Every time the sequence repeats, a group arrives poor and visible. They're framed as dangerous. Violence against them becomes tolerable. Deaths are minimized or misnamed. So when we talk about the dead rabbits, we're not talking about a unique moment of chaos. We're looking at an early chapter in a pattern New York would reuse again and again. This isn't just history repeating itself. It's a reminder of how quickly us versus them becomes policy when fear is easier than reform. And that's the through line from the 1800s to now. Understanding that doesn't require us to defend the past, but it does require us to recognize it before the same logic hardens again under a different name. If this episode made you think differently about what a riot really is, share it. Follow Deadly Truths on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube for more episodes of Dead City, where we examine how urban violence is created, justified, and remembered. Ratings, reviews, and shares help keep these stories visible, especially the ones history tried to bury. And remember, the past isn't dead. It's just waiting for permission to repeat itself.